Are you okay? Are you really okay? Yes, that's today's topic on Me and My Health Up. It's not you are okay, it is mental health. And in particular, we're focusing on men's mental health because it's not in a great state, given that 75% of suicides is men. So we're going to be talking about men's mental health, and we have a great special guest today on the show, Pete Shmigel. So Pete Shmigel is the former CEO of Lifeline Australia, and he established Lifeline in the Ukraine, from where his roots originated. And furthermore, he is appointed member on the New South Wales Mental Health Review Tribunal. And beyond that, Peter runs a recycling of bikes company, which is really fast-growing company where he reuses old bikes essentially. And he also has a sustainability consulting business. He's been the advisor to 8 premiers and also opposition leaders. He is very involved with politics and has also been a journalist in the Ukraine on the front line. So Peter's a man of many talents. He's a wonderful guy, also an amazing father. He's about to become a grandfather. So without much further ado, I'd love to welcome you into the discussion I'm having with Pete Shmigel on men's mental health. Welcome on the show, Pete Shmigel. How are you today?
I'm really well, thank you, Anthony.
Such an honour to have you, as your credentials in mental health speak volumes in terms of your interest. And so I know the Me and My Health Up listeners are very interested in mental health, and the episodes I've recorded on mental health, including the episode with my dad, we spoke about resilience, has been, far reached and lots of downloads. So really excited to have you on, given your connection with my father and how I've been introduced to you. And certainly your backstory around mental health is something the listeners would love to hear about, and how you have ended up being so involved with mental health.
Yeah. Well, look, Anthony, thank you for having me on. First and foremost, it's a real pleasure, and always important to talk about emotional issues and psychological issues and mental health issues. And I find particularly from a male perspective, and I do think there is a male perspective. Look, for us, there's lots of hats that I've had the honor to wear, whether it's Lifeline Australia CEO or on the board of good mental health organizations like the Australian Men's Health Foundation or Roses in the Ocean, which is concerned about suicide prevention. And I had a chance to be involved in founding Lifeline in Ukraine based on the Australian model. But you know what? It's not the hats that matter. It's what we learn through life. And for me and my family, we've had our ups and downs. My son, Tim, was a great student, great athlete, and a very polite guy. And all of that masked the fact that he was really struggling with his mental health. Tim had very, very dark periods of his life. We spent a lot of time in the public health system and elsewhere. And we learned a lot about ourselves, too, and the need to listen. In particular, for good mental health results, to listen without judgment. And at least for us, that's been part of a big journey. And that journey actually kind of culminated when Tim became the second Australian in history to walk from Wilson's Prom to Cape York, 6,500 kilometers. He called it Everyday Steps, and it was a fundraiser for Lifeline, which I was running at the time. But more importantly, it was kind of Tim's graduation ceremony, having never finished high school. It was his kind of way of saying, I'm back in the world and others can follow in these footsteps. Maybe not literally, but that mental illness is something that we can deal with and we can manage and we can move forward in life with.
And from your perspective, looking back, what are the key areas that you've learned about mental health around your son's journey, and I guess even your personal mental health journey? Yeah.
One of them is the myth that got challenged in our own experience. And there's a myth that basically men don't talk about their emotions. And I actually think that's a kind of dangerous myth, because men actually do communicate about their emotions. But what I had to learn, and I think more and more people in the community and society are learning, is that men communicate very differently about their emotions. They may not use words like, I'm feeling sad, or I think I'm depressed, or geez, I'm feeling really anxious. They may not use those kind of acceptable terminology, but they will different verbal clues and different physical clues, be saying exactly all those same things. Like, I've got the shits, or that really pissed me off. Or, one of the classic ones I talk about, Anthony, is how men at barbecues always stand around the barbecue and they talk and they talk and they talk and they talk, and they never look at each other. They stand shoulder to shoulder looking at the barbecue. And there's just nothing wrong with that. I think that one of the things that we learned is that men, in my case, my son, talk differently about their emotions, and that we have to, as a society, and I had to as a parent, just get better at kind of following the clues and actually really understanding what's going on there. And not just listening, but really respecting what was being said.
Yeah, so it's
respectfulness, Mario. I think that's a big part of the mental health journey, is just, respecting where people are at, and not trying to change them, not trying to give them advice, not trying to give them silver bullets. Just respect where they're at and support them in the way that you can at the time.
Yeah, so the cues that you found was really looking out for that expression of anger or frustration, that irritability as sort of key signs amongst men as to something's not quite right. And
behaviours, mate. Because, again, men communicate differently. They don't necessarily communicate verbally. They communicate through their behaviors. So, again, to personalize it in Tim's case, top-level athlete who suddenly started saying things like, I don't want to go to the state championships, and I don't feel like playing for the first 15 this year, and I got to say, I was off my game as a parent, because I interpret that as kind of like, oh, this is teenage laziness or whatever. No, it was, I just wasn't listening and observing keenly enough to say, this guy actually wants a different kind of life than the one that he's been put into by his kind of A grade kind of parents, right? So yeah, behaviors, whether your mate is going to the pub too much, whether your mate basically isn't turning up for work, whether your mate, is isolating himself a lot. That's a big sign amongst men, is isolation. Yeah, it's watching out those behaviors and doing more than saying, are you okay? Because, again, men don't quite do that. It's more about saying, what's going on for you? I notice you haven't been at work for the last 3 days, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so it's recognizing that change of behavior within men, and then essentially stating that you've observed this change and how you can support them, or how you can best help them.
Yeah, women are brilliant at this, right?
Yeah,
women are brilliant at noticing the changes in their partners and at noticing the changes in the people around them. They're more attuned to it. I don't know why, but they're much better at holding up the mirror and saying, well, hang on a second, you've been on the lounge watching sport for 4 days, or the only thing you do around this house is basically stay on your betting app, right? And, in the case of many men, they get angry or irritable at it, because that is a very classic male emotion. Anger is okay, but it's really just a peak of an iceberg that says, hang on, there's something else going on here. So yeah, women are terrific at picking the emotion, at picking the behaviors, and we'd be doing ourselves a big favor if we often listen to our partners a lot more about ourselves.
Very true. So men out there, check in with the women, because if they'll notice something, I guess subtle changes within men.
It's only natural. I mean, they're the ones spending the most amount of time with us, so they're the best students of who we are and what we're like and stuff like that. So it only goes it only follows to reason that basically they see those shifts, those kind of like deviations from the normal pattern. And often those deviations can indicate, that there's something going on beneath the surface. Whether, for men, for instance, at Lifeline, we knew that a lot of the men who were calling about financial problems. They'd get to that eventually in the conversation. Gambling was a big reason a lot of men were calling, increasing in our society now. Really sad. Relationship problems, of course. A lot of work-related stuff, right? And the men seem to take a lot of their status comes from their jobs and from their work. And if that environment isn't kind of right and settled, it can be a real not cause, but can be a real kind of like button pusher, right?
Yeah. Okay. That sort of going out there, earning the money for the family, and coming home and making sure there's money to support the family. Essentially, a
lot of social expectations around that, and many men who find themselves in crisis feel that they have somehow let the side down, right, in that regard, and let themselves down as a result too. And we don't have a lot of skills for that in society. When are you taught at school, right, or even sometimes by your own parents, to say, you're going to fail, yeah, you're going to try hard. You're going to work hard. You probably make things right. You probably get yourself a good job. You probably set yourself up in a family. But you know what? Every once in a while, for reasons of your own, or for reasons outside your control, you're going to fall flat on your face, right? And it's not necessarily your fault. It's just that's the pattern of life. And yet, I don't think, unless maybe we're raised in a very church environment, we don't get a sense of those, how those up and downs are very normal, and we just kind of got to learn how to accept them, especially as men, that we can't all be Superman all the time.
Yeah, it's the ebbs and flows in life. And I think women are certainly experiencing that now, given their rise in their careers and doing well in that career aspect. And so they're now experiencing what, certainly men have been going through for quite some time around those, like you have those rises in your career and then you have those moments where it's not so great. But it's certainly, it brings about a lot of learning when we have those moments, like
usually cliches are true. And one of them is that failure is the best teacher. And I would say for myself, my own failure as a parent to be there for my kid when he needed me to be there, at one point in his life, was what opened my eyes up a lot to this notion of respectful listening and non-judgment, and don't give advice unless you're asked to give advice. In Indigenous language in Victoria, there's a word called dadiri, and dadiri is a great word. Indigenous languages sometimes are very complex. Dadiri means listening deeply with loving intent. Right? What a great word, right? Is that you're not thinking about what your answer is going to be or what advice you're going to give next, or, judging why this person is saying this to you or not saying this to you. You're just there for them, right? And I just think that that's really powerful. And, sometimes with your own mates or your own family, sometimes when they're completely attuned to whatever you're on about, and the power that gives you, it's massive. I mean, call it love. I don't know what you call it, but, it gets you through.
And so there's listeners out there that are parents raising teenage children or even pre-adolescence children. What advice or recommendations would you share with these parents?
Well, look, benefit from the fact that we have had a near revolution in mental health in the last 20 years. The situation I'm describing about my son was more than 15, 20 years ago now. The amount of resources out there now for parents compared to then is wonderful. So it doesn't matter where you go online, from Headspace downwards, there is just so much information about, observing signs, how to listen appropriately. We sometimes always try to think, why does my son or daughter talk to me most in the car, right? And it's, there's science behind all this even, it's a safe, protected environment, and it's very private, and, you're in between things. It's nothing to distract you. So, look, there's tons of tools out there, and I think, let's use the internet's power for good and get to those tools. But look, at the end of the day, I think it all starts from, just an absolute willingness to sacrifice and be there unconditionally for our kids. Really does.
And in terms of, for the men out there, you've had a lot of experience through Lifeline and being on these advisory boards and whatnot. And as you mentioned before, men very much identify themselves around that protector provider. And if that's not going well, then they feel their self-worth is just not there and they lose that identity. For the men out there, what would you like to share with them?
Look, I don't know about you, Anthony, but I am a Jordan Peterson fan. I mean, the guy cops, a great deal of criticism, more for his politics than for anything he does in psychology. I mean, I went to see him last time he was in Sydney. He spent all of about 10 seconds talking about politics, and the other 99.9% of the time he was just giving very straightforward, commonsensical advice based on, his long years of research and dealing with people in trouble. You know what? The two things that he basically says more than anything else, and I swear to God he's right, is sleep enough and eat well, and it really starts from that kind of base. If you don't have the fundamentals in place of being rested and having the right foods to kind of propel you through the day and stuff like that, everything else is not going to work. So I think that the first and foremost thing that we can do as men is just make sure our basics are in order, right? And then once we've got those basics in order, that's when we can start thinking more about all the other things about how do I fill in my mental health bucket? Is it with sport? Is it with photography? Is it with this, that, the other thing? But get the basics done right, and I applaud your work in that regard.
Absolutely, it does. It starts with the fundamentals of good health, and we, as much as we might want to focus on those micronutrients, such as have we getting enough magnesium and all these, it really starts with the basics, as you said. It's are you just having the right macros, which is the fats, the proteins, the carbohydrates, clean, lean, as they say, and then are you getting enough sleep at night?
Look how much the world has changed. I mean, even in your lifetime, Anthony, that, I only probably came across discussion around macro foods and things like that, macro food groups probably in the last 5 years. And you look at it and you go, wow, that's just makes so much sense. But it's taken us a long time to get back to these kind of like basic kind of rules and insights about what we put in our gut and what we put in our brain and stuff like that. I think it makes perfect sense too, because, the world's so complicated now, right? So from the time that you and I woke up in the morning till now that we're talking, we probably both saw about 3,000 communication messages, billboards, radio ads, et cetera, et cetera. And we learn how to filter all that stuff out because there's just too much of it. So I think that, keeping it simple is such a great mantra for modern life. And that's keeping it simple with your diet, keeping it simple with your mental well-being, keeping it simple with your relationships. Just bring it back to the fundamentals, right?
And another one of those fundamentals is relationships. And there's that longitudinal study that was, still running today in Harvard University. It's around that study of happiness, and it started with the study of men. And the reason why it was men, it was just it started in 1930s. And so, and they studied 2 pools of men from around the Boston area, Harvard University students. One was JFK, and then the other pool was in the not so well-off areas of Boston. And they studied these men through the decades, taking blood samples, interviewing partners, interviewing family members. And it's really just collected a huge amount of biochemical data, as well as relationship data, as well as that anecdotal, how you're feeling sort of data. And what they found, one of the conclusions of the studies, even though it's still going today, they're studying the generations of these people that originated in the study, was that the men who were most happiest in their 80s had the best relationships in their 50s.
Wow.
And I'm reading a lot today in terms of this relationship issue that men have as they go through the decades. So at school, they've got mates and they're hanging out with their mates, and they're 9 to 3 with their mates, and then they might do some after school sports with their mates, and on weekends they're sort of hanging out. And as they go to university, they go different universities or different pathways, and so that friendship sort of dwindles away. And I've certainly noticed that. And then they form some friends in university. They're studying the same course, but then they go off and get different jobs, and they meet a partner, and then they go to different areas. And men generally aren't great at keeping those relationships going, and so it falls by the wayside. And as they get into those midlife years, it's very much the female circle of friends that the men are being part of. And I was just wondering, through your experience and working with these mental health community services, what can you?
You're spot on. I think that study makes so much sense to me. It resonates so much, that the importance of connection in men's lives, right? We talked about before about isolation is one of those behavioral signs that that things aren't quite going right. So therefore, the opposite is connection, right? To make things go right. And one of the things that's been really cool over about the last 5 years is the rise of grassroots-based men's groups. So, men are taking responsibility all over the country. I mean, the dudes who organize the picnics in public parks, or the guys who organize the bike rides, or, some of it has names, some of it is completely informal. But I think that the men are actually increasingly doing a great job of taking responsibility for their mental health and their health by saying, I really need to have other male friends in my life, particularly as I get older. So I'm very lucky that way. I'm still in daily contact with 9 of the guys that I went to year 1 with in the United States.
Oh, wow.
So we've been friends for 54 years. We did our 50th birthdays together. And then I belong to a group called the Parramatta Pikers. And the Parramatta Pikers are just a bunch of guys who've gotten to know each other over the last 4 or 5 years from the local Parramatta community. A lot of us involved in business or politics or arts or sport in the Parramatta area. And every Saturday morning at 8:30, we get together for the Pike. And the Pike is this pseudo pretend jog that we do that's really just a slow walk, and ends up at a breakfast at one of the local cafes, right? And the main focus always is, who's piked this week, and it's actually a really cool name and a really kind of cool system, because if somebody's piked, let's say, for 3, 4, 5 weeks in a row, then you start to ask the question, well, what's going on, right? Behavioral change, right? So look, I think that's so important, is this notion of men continuing to talk to men as they get older in particular. And, go back to what we started with. Men do talk. They just talk differently. And they need places to do that aren't completely dictated by, political correctness or social norms. And, and every male that's listening to this knows that, there's stuff you can say. Right. And, it sounds awful if it were to ever be tape recorded or put down on paper and stuff like that. But that it's playful, and that it's just guys having fun with guys. Hopefully it's not to the detriment of anyone else, and it's not offensive to anyone else. But yeah, sometimes men need to behave like lads a little bit.
Yeah, and also I've been reading articles in the area that in terms of how men connect is through like an activity. There's got to be, and that's the Parramatta Pikers meet and first do the walk, and then you have afterwards you have the breakfast, the
That's
gathering.
Right.
That
like bicycles, you see bicycles all across Sydney and New South Wales nowadays. All the guys in the Lycra and stuff like that. And you see them having more coffee than you having than riding. But nevertheless, you're right. There has to be that kind of at least that 5-10 minutes, whatever, that pretext of doing something. Men's sheds. What a brilliant movement. The old guys getting together and fixing, kettles or making pieces of furniture, or in fact, fixing bicycles is part of what I do. What a great idea, to have that kind of common activity. We know with our own sons that it's always easier to connect and talk and be together when you actually have something to do together, whether it's something handy or whether it's something sporting. My son and I, bushwalking is our thing, right?
Right.
It has been since he was a tiny kid. And I hope it will be with our grandson too now. But yeah, activity. One thing to reflect on is up until 150 years ago, our lives were based on doing stuff, not talking, right? We were either in a factory doing stuff, or we were in the trades doing stuff, or we were on a farm doing stuff. It's only 150, 200 years since that's changed radically, where people like you and me can make most of our living by talking.
Yeah.
Right. And you got to ask yourself, well, we were doing something for millions and millions of years, and now in the last 150, 200 years, we've changed it completely. It's got to be an impact, right?
Yeah.
So I think the importance of getting back to doing stuff is really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, there's a number of groups you mentioned, the men's sheds, the Parramatta Pikers, the barbecue group that get together and hang around the barbecue and cook snags and whatnot, meet up parks. And
there's a great directory actually on the Australian Men's Health Forum website. You have like a whole long list of all of these kind of groups that have popped up around the country now. Like one of my favorites is down in Victoria. It's called HALT, and I'm going to forget what HALT means, but HALT was founded by a group of tradies in regional Victoria, guys who are chippies and painters and sparkies and stuff like that. And they got together and they said, we spend all this time alone on our sites, and we spend all this time alone on our, driving from job to job, etc. And they actually kind of noticed amongst themselves, it's quite lonely to be a tradie sometimes, right? It's you and your apprentice. If you're doing a small thing, you got an apprentice. And so now they have this really, really cool program where having kind of educated themselves, they now actually go out to like all these kind of light industrial parks, and they do these toolbox talks. And, they literally grab guys for 10, 15 minutes at a time while they're doing something in the middle of their jobs and say, okay, well, here's some quick and handy tips, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, look, men's health isn't going to be solved by anybody but men. If we want to live longer, as long as the women in our lives live, if we want to have less heart attacks, if we want to reduce the suicide rate, 75% of suicides are male, all of that basically starts with us taking responsibility for our own health. And sure, the women in our lives are amazing and beautiful and terrific, but we actually have to be the ones who take the steps as well.
Fantastic. Final concluding words there, Pete. I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure the listeners have really been, really intrigued with the insight you've shared around men's mental health and your experience of certainly raising children and making sure you have that safe space and for children to speak out. I'll certainly include that link that you mentioned in terms of the men's mental health services. I'll include that in the show notes so the listeners can go directly to there and check it out.
Terrific.
And any other words you'd like to pass before we wrap up the episode?
Be well.
Yeah. Nice. Just simple, and men are very simple. So they're very simple. And yeah, as Pete mentioned throughout the episode we have a different way of communicating, shoulder to shoulder, just being with one another. And certainly, we feel a bit daunted by the eye contact, and that's the preferred way in which women communicate. So
Anthony, thank you for everything that you're doing. I'm really appreciative of efforts like yours, and I think you probably are touching more lives than you know, and it's a credit to you, and it's a credit to your family. So, more strength to your arm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Pete, and thank you, listeners. Thank you for tuning in for another insightful episode of Me and My Health Up. Please share it with other men that you know out there. It could be really beneficial for them. Women, please impart the wisdom from Pete and embrace it in your relationships, and you'll raise a successful family and have a successful relationship. So thank you, listeners, and thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Anthony.
Podcast disclaimer. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare or professional advice and are provided for general information purposes only. All care is taken in the preparation of the information in this podcast. Connected Wellness Proprietary Limited, operating under the brand Me and My Health Up, does not make any representations or give any warranties about its accuracy, reliability, completeness, or suitability for any particular purpose. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it are not to be used as a substitute for professional, medical, psychological, psychiatric, or any other mental health care or healthcare in general. Me and My Health Up recommends you seek the advice of a doctor or qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Inform your doctor of any changes that you may to your lifestyle and discuss these with your doctor. Do not disregard medical advice or delay visiting a medical professional because of something you hear in this podcast. This podcast has been carefully prepared on the basis of current information. Changes in circumstances after publication may affect the accuracy of this information. To the maximum extent permitted by the law, Me and My Health Up disclaims any such representations or warranties to the completeness, accuracy, merchantability, or fitness for purpose of this podcast and will not be liable for any expenses, losses, damages incurred, indirect or consequential damages or costs that may be incurred as a result of the information being inaccurate or incomplete in any way and for any reason. No part of this podcast can be reproduced, redistributed, published, copied, or duplicated in a form without prior permission of Me and My Health Up.